Alright, last time we discussed, I think the last video was on the rules that you must follow when discussing the history of philosophy, right? So now we'll be talking about historical consciousness, which in an earlier version of this video, I mentioned to be historical thinking. Now, why is this relevant to a historical introduction to philosophy course? It is because, of course, we have to look at history, right? The history of philosophy. So we must be attuned to the way of thinking, right, that is proper to history. And that's simply what I called historical thinking. But when I look at the literature, historical thinking technically has a very specific definition, which is not as rich as the concept that I had in my mind. Historical thinking in the literature is typically defined simply in terms of historical literacies, meaning when you are thinking historically, that simply means that you are doing what historians are doing, qua historians, or as historians, meaning you are gathering historical evidence, you're analyzing them, you're contextualizing them based on what happened at that period, at that place, etc. So that's all that historical thinking is. So the historical thinking skills are simply those the capacity to do those things, right? To do those literacies, right, that are proper to historians. But historical consciousness is a richer concept than that. And according to Hans Ruin, historical consciousness really is the origin of the thinner concept, which is historical thinking. Historical consciousness, technically speaking, at least as defined in the German tradition of commentators, you might say, on the concept of historical thinking, historical consciousness is the sum total of human acts by which one's engagement with history becomes responsible. It is not limited only to the cognitive domain, which is that which is focused only on by the concept of historical thinking. It's almost all cognitive, right? Historical thinking skills are wholly cognitive, at least it seems to me. Contextualization requires only knowledge, right, of what happened at that time, and perhaps making connections, right? Making connections, setting the stage and the like. But all that happens only in the mind, in the brain, right? It uses your cognitive capacities. It does not involve the affective dimension, right? As well, the aesthetic dimension. But historical consciousness includes those things, because historical consciousness is the sum total of human acts by which one's engagement with the past becomes responsible. That's historical consciousness. Now, in the process of constructing our thesis, undergraduate thesis at Philo University, we tried to construct a taxonomy of the concept of historical thinking. Now, we have no time to change the title into historical consciousness, right? Historical consciousness, the richer concept that I'm talking about here, which will be relevant to our course. So, for that thesis, we're only constructing a taxonomy of historical thinking in particular. But due to the readings that I had after writing the theoretical background of that thesis, I think we must return to this richer concept, which is the origin of the historical thinking skills concept, which is historical consciousness. And we will be adapting many thinkers, right? In fact, in a recent paper that I presented at the UP Values Education and Philosophy of Education conference, I presented a three-wave chronology of the main contributors of this discussion. The first wave are mainly philosophers who thought about historical consciousness. I think the list I included there was composed of R.G. Collingwood, Friedrich Nietzsche, Wells, Jerome Bruner, and Hans Georg Gadamer. So those four, they produced, they reflected on the concept of historical consciousness, either primarily directly, right, or either sometimes indirectly. Nietzsche, I think, was the one who reflected on it head on, right? In one of his books or in one of his essays. But that's the first wave. The second wave are educators who try to pedagogize historical consciousness, meaning those who try to take the best out of the first wave and then make them measurable, right? They try to make historical consciousness measurable. Why? Because if you have to make a topic teachable to students, right? You have to make it measurable. That's the rule in pedagogy, right? So that you can measure whether that student really progressed, right, towards that standard, towards that objective, right? Whether they really acquired such skill. And therefore, this second wave really tried to make historical consciousness measurable. And the result of that is the concept of historical thinking, right? Which specifies, there's no common number, but a few, right? We might say 6, some say 3, some say 4. 6 historical thinking concepts like contextualization, synthesis, continuity and change over time, contextualization, and the like. So these are the historical thinking skills, and students will be tested on these skills, on how much they how well they master these skills. And then the third wave are later commentators on the earlier waves. We have Hans Ruin, we have Nathalie Popa, etc. There are many thinkers who wrote on historical consciousness. And this taxonomy that we constructed, and we submitted this to one paper, we don't know if this will be accepted, but this is the taxonomy that we submitted there. There we presented or illustrated historical consciousness as having 3 main elements. First, the subject, right? That entity that possesses, quote unquote, right? The haver of the construct, which is historical consciousness, or the reality of the reality designated by the concept of historical consciousness. So the subject, right, which holds that reality is, of course, the human being, who, precisely because he is thinking historically, becomes a historian. So the subject of historical consciousness is the historian, of course. The subject, as we know, in philosophy, or even in natural, normal, regular English, I think, the subject is that which holds or possesses something. So the subject of, for example, of yellowness of a mango is the mango. So in the same way, the subject of historical consciousness is the historian. Now, what is the historian doing, right? Or what is the act, what is the formal feature by which the human being becomes a historian? The formal feature is this one, historical consciousness, right? And what does one specifically do when one is thinking, one is being historically conscious? According to R.G. Collingwood, one becomes historically conscious when you are doing reenactment. That's a keyword from R.G. Collingwood. What do you mean by reenactment? You are reenacting when you are gathering traces of the past, right? In order to enter the mind of a historical agent, right? Of a person in the past, say Alexander the Great, say Joseph Stalin, say Mother Teresa, say John of the Cross, say Thomas Aquinas, etc. So these are historical agents. These people are historical agents. And reenactment is the means, is the act by which the historian gathers the traces left by these people and then uses them to infer what the mind or what the content of the mind of the historical agent is. So when you are doing that, you are being historically conscious. But not yet. There's still a further condition, right? If you're just doing that sloppily, right, committing many mistakes, you're not yet thinking historically. Why? Because the full definition of historical consciousness is this. It is the sum total of human acts by which one's engagement with the past becomes responsible. So you must be doing such reenactment responsibly. If you're not being responsible in your reenactment, then you are not yet historically conscious. So the responsibility, being responsible about it is a necessary condition for one to be historically conscious. And notice also in the definition, it is the sum total of human acts. Why? Why do we have to qualify the acts there with the word human, or the sum total of human acts? It's because the concept of historical thinking is thinner than that. It is not the sum total of of human acts. It's only focusing on the cognitive domain, right? Because in historical thinking, as we said earlier, the focus there is on your mind's capacity to contextualize, to synthesize, to analyze information, and to argue, etc. But historical consciousness is richer than that. It includes an existential dimension, right? Of recognizing that you have a debt to the past, right? To your ancestors and to the future. So that historical consciousness, for example, really connects you to people in the future. So you have to be responsible today. Why? Because the present moment, what you do at the present moment, shapes your response to your duty to the people in the future, who will be your inheritors. That's historical consciousness. That's very existential, right? That's not only cognitive. So that is also why historical consciousness really connects to the concept of sustainability, right? Or sustainable development, right? Because if you do not have an existential relationship or connection to people in the future who will reap what you have sowed today, that is historical consciousness, then of course, why would you care about a sustainable future? Anyway, you will die 20, 30, 40 years from now, right? Alright, so now this concept, historical consciousness, is what we will try to adopt or assimilate as we try to explore the history of philosophy. So when we look at Aristotle, for instance, how do we approach him in a responsible way? Should we just stop believing in this metaphysics simply because we are already in the age of Newton and Einstein? Are we really fulfilling our debt to Aristotle when we are doing that? Or is that chronological snobbery, in the words of C.S. Lewis? Why don't we give a democracy for the dead? Right? Why won't we listen to them? Aren't we somehow obliged to listen to them because they are as human as us, only spatio-temporally different, right? So that's historical consciousness. So, in other words, we will be reading their texts charitably, right? Not too charitably to the point of distorting history just so that they will be exonerated, no. But we'll be doing our best shot at giving their ideas their due. Alright? So, in this model, there are two aspects of the subject, right, of the historian. His inside, right, his thoughts, right, but also his context, the place, the spatial dimension, the space dimension, and the temporal dimension, the time. So, for example, suppose I am a historian. Technically speaking, I'm not a professional historian, but according to R.G. Collingwood, everyone who thinks historically is a historian, even if that's still a kid, right? So everyone who thinks historically is a historian in a sense, albeit not a professional one. So we all have an insight, right? We all have thoughts, but these thoughts are situated. These thoughts are embodied, right, by a human being who is spatio-temporally contextualized with a very specific set of sociocultural specifications, right? Configuration. And this is unique from individual to individual. And therefore, we must take account of that. We cannot step outside our positionality. We cannot step outside of our context. And therefore, we have to take into consideration how our culture conditions us to a specific set of biases. Right? So, that's it. the historian must be aware of his inside but also of his outside, the context that he's in, so that he will be self-aware, he will be reflexive about the potential biases that he will be tempted to adapt to wear, right? To wear like a glass, right? When looking at a historical agent. Now, the same is true with the historical agent that the historian is studying, the object of study. The aim for reenactment is to enter that historical agent's mind. However, we do not have direct access to that mind, right? What we have are things, tangible things that we can, that things that are traces of the actions of that historical agent, from which we can infer what is going on inside his mind, right? And therefore, we also have to study the positionality of that very person that we're studying, of that historical agent. So we need to, for example, when studying Plato, we must recognize that he was, for example, a student of Socrates, and how that affects the way he thinks. When we study Heidegger, we must recognize how he was a student of Husserl, and maybe that affects how Heidegger was thinking, and why, even if Heidegger and Edith Stein are both students of Husserl, both have very different views on life. Both have very different systems of thought. Even if Augustine and Aquinas are both Catholic philosophers, they differ on some things, although there's also much continuity between them. Why? Because they have different positionalities. They are situated in different contexts, spatial-temporal, right, and also socio-cultural, right? It's very interesting to compare, for example, Nietzsche and Aquinas. Why? Because they are very different. They're very different. They were living in a different milieu, right? Aquinas was living in a period when God was not yet dead, but Nietzsche already was in a position to say God is dead and we have killed him, right? So we must take account of the cultural milieu, right, that these historical agents are situated in. But to do that, right, to make this process of thinking historically, or to make our consciousness of history responsible, to make it responsible, we must employ an iterative, right? An iterative means a process that is done over and over again. What sort of process is this? The process is this. It contains two elements: method, historical method, and historical presuppositions. So this is from Collingwood, still from Collingwood. Notice that our presuppositions, which are often shaped by our past experiences or shaped by the culture that we are in, right? Some of them are just at the surface. We presuppose them because we just recall them because they're being told to us, or right, they just operate at the surface level. So this includes knowledge of specific memory of specific facts, right? Like, for example, Jose Rizal was killed at Bagumbayan. Remember that. That's part of our historical presuppositions. It's part of our memory. But since it's only at the surface, it's distinct from presuppositions that operate at the deeper level. Right? And these deeper presuppositions are what we call perspective. Right? Perspective. These include your entire orientation to life, your philosophical views, which span your metaphysical views, right? What you think to be real in the world, your epistemological views, right? What you think counts as justified true belief or justified beliefs, right? Your axiological views, what is valuable for you, what life is for, right? Your axiology, your view on that's the existential dimension, right? These are all deep presuppositions, and these could frame the hypotheses right, that you have regarding history. Now, these hypotheses will remain as hypotheses and not true, we might say, or at least not justifiably held if we do not subject them to the proper method of testing, right, of verification. And how do we verify our historical presuppositions? Either those that operate at the surface level, which we call memory, and those at the deeper level, which we call perspective. It is through the application of a certain method, right, a method appropriate to the hypothesis. So if that hypothesis is best measured using the historical method, then we must test it using the historical method. If it is best tested using a philosophical method, right, through logical and conceptual analysis, for instance, or something like that, then you will use a philosophical method, etc. So, example, if we are talking here about judging whether what Hitler did during the Holocaust was good, that's part of the deeper presuppositions, right? That's part of perspective. That's part of your axiological orientation. So we'll be testing that through the method appropriate to it. That is ethics. That's part of philosophy. So here we see that a proper historical consciousness requires you to master not only historical method, although that's very important, but also philosophical method, right? And so in our paper, we discussed how philosophers and historians must work hand in hand together in the process of pedagogizing or making teachable historical consciousness. And because educators are the best people who know how to pedagogize, then educators must work together with historians and philosophers as well. We can include psychologists as well, etc. So there's much to do for historical consciousness to really be properly pedagogized, right? At least in the current setting, etc. So that's it. So the point here is that this iterative process of drawing out, piecing out hypotheses from our presuppositions, testing them using the proper method, which results in a conclusion, which in turn could again be tested, right? Because at some point, either that conclusion perhaps might have some mistakes, right? Or might not be fully justified yet, or we could have a better method soon, or we have better background data that we could use in order to retest it, right? So we could test it again, right? We could again let it be framed by our presuppositions and then test it using the method again, and then frame again using our presuppositions and then test it through a method again, etc. That's the iterative process that I'm talking about, which we call historical consciousness. And this does not have to be done, or this is not necessarily done by academics alone. Even students from the grade school level, even to the high school level, can already do at least a part of it, right? That's the significant contribution of Jerome Bruner, right? That any subject, any discipline can be taught to any age, provided that it is framed, it is structured in a way that is appropriate to the developmental stage of that person. So that's it. So now, we must be historically conscious. This is the proper orientation that we must have in our study of the history of philosophy. What form would that specifically take? We'll see when, in a future video, we'll be going to the very first milestone in the history of philosophy. Thank you, and see you.